Chapter 6 of the Recollections of the Civil War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ravi Shankar. Recollections of the Civil War by Charles Dana. Chapter 6. The Siege of Vicksburg. Life behind Vicksburg. Grant's efforts to procure reinforcements. The fruitless appeal to General Banks. Mr. Stanton responds to Mr. Dana's representations. A steamboat trip with Grant. Watching Joe Johnston. Visits to Sherman and Admiral Porter. The Negro troops win glory. Progress and incidents of the siege. Vicksburg wakes up. McClellan's removal. We had not been many days in the rear of Vicksburg before we settled into regular habits. The men were detailed in reliefs for work in the trenches, and being relieved at fixed hours, everyone seemed to lead a systematic life. My chief duty throughout the siege was a daily round through the trenches, generally with the corps commander or some one of his staff. As the lines of investment were 3 or 7 miles long, it occupied a greater part of my day. Sometimes I made a portion of my tour of inspection in the night. One night, in riding through the trenches, I must have passed 20,000 men asleep on their guns. I can still see the grotesque positions into which they had curled themselves. The trenches were so protected that there was no danger in riding through them. It was not so safe to venture on the hills overlooking Vicksburg. I went on foot and alone one day to the top of a hill and was looking at the town when suddenly heard something go whiz, whiz by my ear. What in the world is that? I asked myself. The place was so desolate that it was an instant before I could believe that these were bullets intended for me. When I did realize it, I immediately started to lie down. Then came the question, which was the best way to lie down? If I lay at right angles to the enemy's line, the bullets from the left and right might strike me. If I lay parallel to it, then those directly from the front might hit me. So I concluded it made no difference which way I lay. After remaining quiet for a time, the bullets ceased and I left the hilltop. I was more cautious in the future in venturing beyond cover. Through the entire siege, I lived in General Grant's headquarters, which were on a high bluff northeast of Sherman's extreme left. I had a tent to myself, and on the whole was very comfortable. We never lacked for an abundance of provisions. There was good water, enough even for a bath, and we suffered very little from excessive heat. The only serious annoyance was the cannonade from our whole line, which, from the 1st of June, went on steadily by night as well as by day. The following bit from a letter I wrote on June 2nd to my little daughter tells something of my situation. It is real summer weather here, and after coming in at noon today for my usual ride through the trenches, I was very glad to get a cold bath in my tent before dinner. I like living in the tents very well, especially if you ride on horseback all day. Every night I sleep with one side of the tent wide open, and the walls put up all around to get plenty of air. Sometimes I wake up in the night and I think it is raining. The wind roars so in the tops of the great oak forest on the hillside where we are encamped, and I think it is thundering, till I look out and I see the golden moonlight in all its glory, and listen again, and know that it is only the thunder of General Sherman's great guns, that neither rest nor let others rest by night or by day. We were no sooner in position behind Vicksburg than Grant saw that he must have reinforcements. Joe Johnston was hovering near, working with energy to collect forces sufficient to warrant an attempt to relieve Vicksburg. The Confederates were also known to be reorganizing at Jackson. Johnson eventually gathered an army behind Grant of about 25,000 men. Under these threatening circumstances, it was necessary to keep a certain number of troops in our rear, more than Grant could well spare from the siege, and he therefore made every effort to secure reinforcements. He ordered down from Tennessee and elsewhere in his own department all available forces. He also sent to General Banks, who was then besieging Port Hudson, a request to bring his forces up as promptly as practicable, and assuring him that he, Grant, would gladly serve under him as his senior in rank, or simply cooperate with him for the benefit of the common cause if Banks preferred that arrangement. To Halleck, on May 29th, he telegraphed, "If Banks does not come to my assistance, I must be reinforced from elsewhere. I will avoid a surprise, and do the best I can with the means at hand." This was about the extent of Grant's personal appeals to his superiors for additional forces. No doubt, however, he left a good deal to my representations. As no reply came from Banks, I started myself on the 30th for Port Hudson at Grant's desire, to urge that the reinforcements be furnished. The route used for getting out from the rear of Vicksburg at that time was through the Chickasaw Bayou into the Yazoo, and thence into the Mississippi. From the mouth of the Yazoo I crossed the Mississippi to Young's Point, and from there went overland across the peninsula to get a gunboat at a point south of Vicksburg. As we were going down the river, we met a steamer just above the Grand Gulf, bearing one of the previous messengers whom Grant had sent to Banks. He was bringing word that Banks could send no forces. On the other hand, he asked for reinforcements from Grant to aid in his siege of Port Hudson, which he had closely invested. This news, of course, made my trip unnecessary, and I returned at once to headquarters, having been gone no more than 24 hours. As soon as this news came from Banks, I sent an urgent appeal to Mr. Stanton to hurry reinforcements sufficient to make success beyond all peradventure. The government was not slow to appreciate Grant's needs, or the great opportunity he had created. Early in June, I received the following dispatch from Mr. Stanton. War Department, June 5th, 1863. Your telegrams up to the 30th have been received. Everything in the power of this government will be put forth to aid General Grant. The emergency is not underrated here. Your telegrams are a great obligation and are looked for with deep interest. I cannot thank you as much as I feel for the service you are now rendering. You have been appointed an assistant adjutant general, with rank of major, with liberty to report to General Grant if he needs you. The appointment may be a protection to you. I shall expect daily reports if possible. Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. C. A. Dana, Esquire, Grant's headquarters near Vicksburg. My appointment as an assistant adjutant general was Stanton's own idea. He was by nature a very anxious man. When he perceived from my dispatches that I was going every day on expeditions into dangerous territory, he became alarmed lest I might be caught by the Confederates, for as I was a private citizen it would have been difficult to exchange me. If I were in the regular volunteer service as an assistant adjutant general, however, there would be no trouble about an exchange, hence my appointment. The chief variations from my business of watching the siege behind Vicksburg were these trips I made to inspect the operations against the enemy who was now trying to shut us in from the rear beyond the Big Black. His heaviest force was to the northeast. On June 6th, the reports from Satartia, our advance up the Yazoo, were so unsatisfactory that Grant decided to examine the situation there himself. That morning he said to me at breakfast, "Mr. Dana, I am going to Sartatia today. Would you like to go along?" I said I would, and we were soon on horseback, riding with a cavalry guard to Haines' Bluff, where we took a small steamer reserved for Grant's use and carrying his flag. Grant was ill and went to bed soon after he started. We had gone up the river to within 2 miles of Sartatia when we met 2 gunboats coming down. Seeing the general's flag, the officers in charge of the gunboats came aboard our steamer and asked where the general was going. I told them to Sartatia. "Why," said they, "it will not be safe. Kimball," our advance was under the charge of Brigadier General Nathan Kimball, 3rd Division, 16th Army Corps, "has retreated from there and is sending all his supplies to Haines' Bluff. The enemy is probably in the town by now." I told them Grant was sick and asleep, and that I did not want to waken him. They insisted that it was unsafe to go on, and that I would better call the general. Finally, I did so, but he was too sick to decide. "I will leave it with you," he said. I immediately said we would go back to Haines' Bluff, which we did. The next morning Grant came out to breakfast, fresh as a rose, clean shirt, and all quite himself. "Well, Mr. Darner," he said, "I suppose we are at Sartatia now." "No, General," I said. "We are at Haines' Bluff," and I told him what had happened. He did not complain, but as he was short of officers at that point, he asked me to go with a party of cavalry towards Mechanicsburg, to find if it were true, as reported, that Joe Johnston was advancing from Canton to the Big Black. We had a hard ride, not getting back to Vicksburg until the morning of the 8th. The country was like all the rest around Vicksburg, broken, wooded, unpopulous, with bad roads and few streams. It still had many cattle, but the corn was pretty thoroughly cleared out. We found that Johnston had not moved his main force as rumored, and that he could not move it without bringing all his supplies with him. Throughout the siege, an attack from Johnston continued to threaten Grant and to keep a part of our army busy. Almost every one of my dispatches to Mr. Stanton contained rumors of the movements of the Confederates, and the information was so uncertain that often what I reported one day had to be contradicted the next. About the 15th of June the movements of the enemy were so threatening that Grant issued an order extending Sherman's command so as to include Haines' Bluff, and to send there 2 divisions of the 9th Corps under General Parke. These troops had just arrived from Kentucky, and Grant had intended to place them on the extreme left of our besieging line. Although our spies brought in daily reports of forces of the enemy at different points between Yazoo City and Jackson, Johnston's plan did not develop opportunity until the 22nd, when he was said to be crossing the Big Black north of Bridgeport. Sherman immediately started to meet him with about 30,000 troops, including cavalry. 5 brigades more were held in readiness to reinforce him if necessary. The country was scoured by Sherman in efforts to beat Johnston, but no trace of an enemy was found. It was, however, ascertained that he had not advanced, but was still near Canton, and there was no design to attack Johnston until Vicksburg was laid low. Sherman made his way to Bear Creek, northwest of Canton, where he could watch the Confederates, and there went into camp. I went up there several times to visit him, and always came away enthusiastic over his qualities as a soldier. His amazing activity and vigilance pervaded his entire force. The country where he had encamped was exceedingly favorable for defense. He had occupied the commanding points, opened rifle pits where they would add to his advantage, obstructed the crossroads and most of the direct roads also, and ascertained every point where the Big Black could be forded between the line of the Benton on the north and the line of the railroads on the south. By his rapid movements also, and by widely deploying on all the ridges and open headlands, Sherman produced the impression that his forces were 10 times as numerous as they really were. Sherman remained in his camp on Bear Creek through the rest of the siege in order to prevent any possible attack by Joe Johnston, the reports about whose movements continued to be contradictory and uncertain. Another variation in my Vicksburg life was visiting Admiral Porter, who commanded the fleet which hemmed in the city on the river side. Porter was a very active, courageous, fresh-minded man, and an experienced naval officer, and I enjoyed the visits I made to his fleet. His boats were pretty well scattered, for all the Confederates west of the Mississippi were pressing in, and unless watched, might manage to cross somewhere. 7 of the gunboats were south of Vicksburg, 1 at Haynes Bluff, 1 was at Chickasaw Bayou, 1 at Young's Point, 1 at Milliken's Bend, 1 at Lake Providence, 1 at Greenville, 1 at Island 65, 2 were in the White River, and so on. And several were always in motion. They guarded the river so completely that no hostile movement from the west ever succeeded or was likely to do so. The most serious attack from the west during the siege was that on June 7th, when a force of some 2,000 Confederates engaged about 1,000 Negro troops defending Milliken's Bend. This engagement at Milliken's Bend became famous from the conduct of the colored troops. General E.S. Dennis, who saw the battle, told me that it was the hardest fought engagement he had ever seen. It was fought mainly hand to hand. After it was over, many men were found dead with bayonet stabs, and others with their skulls broken open by the butts of muskets. It is impossible, said General Dennis, for men to show greater gallantry than the Negro troops in that fight. The bravery of the blacks in the Battle of Milliken's Bend completely revolutionized the sentiment of the army with regard to the employment of Negro troops. I heard prominent officers who, formerly in private, had sneered at the ideas of the Negroes fighting, express themselves after that as heartily in favor of it. Among the Confederates, however, the feeling was very different. All the reports which came to us showed that both citizens and soldiers on the Confederate side manifested great dismay at the idea of our arming Negroes. They said that such a policy was certain to be followed by insurrection with all its horrors. Although the presence of Joe Johnston on the east and the rumors of invasion by Kirby Smith from the west compelled constant attention, the real work behind Vicksburg was always that of the siege. No amount of outside alarm loosened Grant's hold on the rebel stronghold. The siege went on steadily and effectively. By June 10th, the expected reinforcements began to report. Grant soon had 85,000 men around Vicksburg, and Pemberton's last hope was gone. The first troops to arrive were 8 regiments under General Herron. They came from Missouri, down the Mississippi to Young's Point, where they were debarked and marched across the peninsula, care being taken, of course, that the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg should see the whole march. The troops were then ferried across the Mississippi and took a position south of Vicksburg between Lauman's troops and the Mississippi River, completely closing the lines, and thus finally rendering egress and ingress absolutely impossible. Herron took this position on June 13th. He went to work with so much energy that on the night of the 15th he was able to throw forward his lines on his left, making an advance of 500 yards, and bringing his artillery and rifle pits within 200 or 300 yards of the enemy lines. Herron was a first-rate officer, and the only consummate dandy I ever saw in the army. He was always handsomely dressed. I believe he never went out without patent leather boots on, and you would see him in the middle of a battle. Well, I cannot say exactly that he went into battle with a lace pocket handkerchief, but at all events he always displayed a clean white one. But these little vanities appeared not to detract from his usefulness. Herron had already proved his ability and fighting qualities at the Battle of Prairie Grove, December 7, 1862. Just as our reinforcements arrived, we began to receive encouraging reports from within Vicksburg. Deserters said that the garrison was worn out and hungry. Besides, the defense had for several days been conducted with extraordinary feebleness, which Grant thought was due to the deficiency of ammunition, or to exhaustion and depression in the garrison, or to their retreat to an inner line of defense. The first and third of these causes no doubt operated to some extent, but the second we supposed to be the most influential. The deserters also said that fully 1/3 of the garrison were in hospital, and that officers as well as men had begun to despair of relief from Johnston. These reports from within the town, as well as the progress of the siege and the arrival of reinforcements, pointed so strongly to the speedy surrender of the place that I asked Mr. Stanton in my dispatch of June 14th to please inform me by telegram when he wished me to go to General Rosecrans after the fall of Vicksburg, or whether he had other orders for me. The next day after this letter, however, the enemy laid aside his long-standing inactivity and opened violently with both artillery and musketry. 2 mortars, which the Confederates got into operation that day in front of General A.J. Smith, particularly interested our generals. I remember going with a party of some 20 officials, including Sherman, Ord, McPherson, and Wilson, to the brow of a hill on McPherson's front to watch the battle with our field glasses. From where we could study the whole operation, we saw the shell start from the mortar, sail slowly through the air towards us, fall to the ground, and explode, digging out a hole which looked like a crater. I remember one of these craters, which must have been 9 feet in diameter. As you watched a shell coming, you could not tell whether it would fall 1,000 feet away or by your side, yet nobody budged. The men sat there on their horses, their reins loose, studying and discussing the work of the batteries, apparently indifferent to the danger. It was very interesting as a study of human steadiness. By the middle of June, our lines were so near the enemy's on Sherman and McPherson's front that General Grant began to consider the project of another general assault, as soon as McClellan, Lauman's, and Herron's lines were brought up close. Accordingly, Sherman and McPherson were directed to hold their work until others were up to them. Herron, of course, had not had time to advance, though since his arrival he had worked with great energy. Lauman had done little in the way of regular approaches, but the chief difficulty in the way was the backwardness of McClellan. His trenches were mere rifle pits, 3 or 4 feet wide, and would allow neither the passage of artillery nor the assemblage of any considerable number of troops. His battles were, with scarcely an exception, in the position they apparently had held when the siege was opened. This obstacle to success was soon removed. On the 18th of June, McClellan was relieved and General Ord put into his place. The immediate occasion of McClellan's removal was a congratulatory address to the 30th Corps, which had fulminated in May, and which first reached the besieging army in a copy of the Missouri Democrat. In this extraordinary address, McClellan claimed for himself most of the glory of the campaign, reaffirmed that on May 22nd he had held 2 rebel forts for several hours, and imputed to other officers and troops failure to support him in their possession, which must have resulted in the capture of the town, etc., though this congratulatory address was the occasion of McClellan's removal. The real causes of it dated further back. These causes, as I understood at the time, were his repeated disobedience of important orders, his general unfortunate mental disposition, and his palpable incompetence for duties of his position. I learned, in private conversation, that in General Grant's judgment it was necessary that McClellan should be removed from the reason, above all, that his bad relations with other corps commanders, especially Sherman and McPherson, rendered it impossible that the chief command of the army should devolve upon him, as it would have done were General Grant disabled, without some pernicious consequence to the Union cause. End of chapter. Recording by Ravi Shankar.